Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now, as ever, to the papers. There are two really big stories dominating the headlines today. The first is the fallout from the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook scandal. There's the Sunday Telegraph. Facebook was warned of data risks 7 years ago, and they've got a picture of the Cambridge women's boat winning team there as well. Same story, the Observer here. This is the Brexit insider. This is the whistleblower who's been at the centre of the revelations over the past 12 hours or so. And he claims the Vote Leave team knew that they may have broken the law. We'll talk a lot about that with Carol Cadwallader later on. Then there's the Mail on Sunday there. This is the other story. Oh, no, this is the same story, I beg your pardon. There are almost too many words in this headline. MPs aid in toxic sex row over pro-Brexit cash plot. Phew. That's a slightly tangled story, which we'll again talk about later on. The other story is the government are clearly making a big push to spend more money on the NHS, including on midwives. Call the midwives is the Sunday Express headline there. And the Sunday Times, May orders £4 billion Brexit boost to save ailing NHS. And there's an implication inside the paper that this will involve a new NHS tax of some kind or another. With me to review the papers are Carol Cadwallader and Isabel Oakeshott. Let's start, shall we, with the health story, Isabel, that front page story.
So there's a very excitable headline on the front of the Sunday Times suggesting that the Prime Minister is going to order a £4 billion annual boost to the NHS. Yeah. I think we have to reel back from this a little bit. I think the Sunday Times have got a little bit carried away on this. The mood that I'm sensing from the powers that be this morning is that this isn't quite going to happen on this scale.
They've oversold it slightly.
I think so. I mean, certainly there is a recognition in number 10 that the NHS does need more money, but that is a huge amount, and I don't sense any appetite for a so-called ring-fence tax on this.
Absolutely. And the Mail on Sunday, which you've just got underneath there, has interviewed Jeremy Hunt, who's, again, I was saying there's an implication there that there's going to be some kind of new tax. But again, it's not absolutely clear. He said they're going to look at all the options.
I suspect Jeremy Hunt would like that tax. You know, he absolutely believes in the case that the NHS is ailing, it does need more money. But I think number 10 feels that just throwing money, quite rightly, that just throwing money at the NHS isn't the answer to all its problems. They point out that actually they've already been given the NHS quite a good boost financially in the most recent budget. So I think we probably have to take a step back from this. Quite like the stuff about the promise on midwives, this idea that women in their pregnancies should get some continuity of care, which actually just doesn't happen at all. Again, I think it's been a bit overwritten, and the chances of that happening, every woman having the same midwife all through her pregnancy and beyond through labour.
Nice idea, but
ain't going to happen. Yeah. It's very expensive.
Carol, let's turn to the other big story, the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook story. You have been following this for a couple of years now, tweeting, writing about it relentlessly and endlessly. The Sunday Telegraph has a big story about Facebook knowing about this 7 years ago, which is interesting, given what's happened to their share price in the last couple of weeks. Can I ask you, first of all, was there a moment when you suddenly realised there's a heck of a story here?
It was a sort of gradual realisation. I first wrote the words Cambridge and Analytica in a story last December, so just over a year ago. And we started getting these letters at the Observer from Cambridge Analytica, and they just didn't make any sense, because they said that they'd been on record about how they'd worked for the Leave campaign, and they were all over the internet. There was quotes from their CEO, and there was quotes from the Leave campaign. And I just there was a sentence in an article where I said, Cambridge Analytica, who worked for the Leave campaign. And they started writing letters saying, we never worked for the Leave campaign. Right. And we wrote back and said, here is where you say you do. And they kept on writing back again. So it was that there was just something which didn't add up. Okay. And that's really the thing that's...
And it's gone on and on and on. And there is an implication at the moment that this is somehow to do, therefore, with the Brexit campaign having been run improperly in some way. And this is the whistleblower. You've got the front page of the Observer today.
So this is a continuation. Last week, the Observer, we did this story, 50 million profiles harvested from Facebook.
But not British profiles, we should say,
well,
American profiles.
Well, there were mainly Americans, but there was a dragnet, so all sorts of nationalities, including British ones, were caught up in that. So we've seen this kind of incredible fallout, $79 billion I think, wiped off Facebook's share price.
That's your fault, Carol Cadwallader. That's a lot of money to be responsible for.
It's kind of mind-blowing. Is that a week ago, Facebook, last Friday, The Observer got a legal letter from Facebook. They tried to shut this story down. They did not want us to publish that. And, you know, we were absolutely certain we were going to go ahead and publish, and that's been the...
Carol, you know a lot more about this than I do, but I have tried to look at this as closely as possible, and I don't actually see an unentangleable link between Cambridge Analytica and the Facebook trawl on the one hand and the Brexit campaign on the other. There have been lots of contact, lots of finger-touching, but no real provable link.
No, that's completely wrong, Andrew. You've got that very, very wrong.
Where's the provable link?
Because Cambridge Analytica, which we've seen the fallout of that this week, we've seen what's happened to Facebook.
Where's the provable link?
The provable link is through to this firm in Canada. So we had a company...
They say they're not linked with Cambridge Analytica, don't they?
Well, our guy, Christopher Wiley, who I've spent a year working with to come forward, can tell you absolutely categorically, he helped set up Cambridge Analytica, he helped set up aggregate...
Carol, I just feel this is utterly baffling to most people. I think you've done a fantastic job of investigative journalism here. You've been incredibly persistent, incredibly dogged, but at the end of it, all I think you've proved is that Cambridge Analytica is a pretty dodgy and bad company. I do not see an iota of evidence, one iota of evidence, that anything they may or may not have done had any impact whatsoever on the Brexit vote.
We should say also that, Isabel, you were part of Leave.eu, one of the two Leave campaigns. And again, we know that Aaron Banks was involved in that campaign, was involved with one of the Cambridge Analytica people, because we've seen them on a photograph together. Staring into mid-space.
Absolutely,
so we know there was some kind of
there just isn't a conspiracy here. I mean, Carol, I just feel that you're kind of chasing unicorns.
It's not a conspiracy. It's big tech companies which are unaccountable and uncontrollable, and we don't know what's going on. So this has all happened inside Facebook.
I'm really looking forward to your next investigation.
So you've talked about Chris Wiley, which to people watching, he's the guy with the red hair.
He's the guy with the pink hair.
Did you know that he had pitched to Vote Leave? Using the same kind of... You knew this?
Yes, of course I did. He met with Vote Leave strategist in the autumn before the referendum, and he told Dominic Cummings, the strategist of Vote Leave, about Cambridge Analytica. And
Dominic Cummings said, I think you're dodgy, and had nothing to do with him, to be fair.
No, precisely, as the same went for Leave.eu, who also ended up didn't using them at all. They did not use them.
Who was proven, we had somebody else come forward on Friday and say categorically, Cambridge Analytica worked for Leave.eu.
They didn't work for Leave.eu. That is just inaccurate. Carol, I was on the inside of the campaign. They did not. They did some work for UKIP. That is not the same thing. Listen, Carol, I have one question for you, and that is, I think you've done a brilliant job. Are you going to apply this same forensic investigation to the Remain campaign? Are you?
This isn't about Remain or Leave. It is not about Remain or Leave.
So you're not going to do an investigation into their spending?
Disrupting our democracy. It's such a serious issue.
So you're not going to do an investigation into the Remain campaign?
With party politics.
But it quite patently is. Otherwise, you would be doing that investigation.
Let me just jump into that, because Dominic Cummings, who we've talked about, says that you are a passionate opponent of Brexit. You've said tweets like Brexit stinks and all the rest of it. And he's also said they promised Watergate and delivered a dodgy Zoolander. So what's your message back to Dominic Cummings?
My message to Dominic Cummings is a really, really smart, intelligent guy, and he knows the power of technology. He spent, I think it was 98% of the budget essentially went on online campaigning. They know the power of digital. They know the power of these Facebook ads. That's why they spent all their money there. So it's...
So Where do you think this is going next?
I think where it's going next is we desperately have to look at our electoral laws. We cannot, at the moment, there is absolutely... Our democracy depends upon controlling spending in elections. And at the moment, there is absolutely no way of controlling and enforcing that. So we urgently need to review our legislation.
And I'm looking forward to your investigation on Remain spending. I can't wait. I'm sure you'll do a fantastic job.
We're going to move on now, he said briskly, to Brexit and the Sunday Telegraph, where David Davis has been writing. It's been a very big week for Brexit, of course. We shouldn't lose sight of that. Monday, Tuesday were really big days.
So I know we're going to be talking, I hope, to David Davis later. This is a very upbeat piece by David Davis, essentially saying we're 3/4 of the way there, folks. We've kind of got over the main hurdles in the negotiation, and now we can look forward to the sunlit uplands of Brexit. Of course, he would say that. I think there's a lot to go. I think Brexiteers are still extremely nervous about the detail of this, and in particular on the transition, and this feeling that actually nothing's going to change during the transition.
William Rees-Mogg, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I beg your pardon, Jacob Rees-Mogg, get my Rees-Moggs right, writing in the Express, says that there's a real possibility that the transition becomes the permanent state, and if that was true, it would be as big a national humiliation as Suez.
Well, lovely flowery language there. I mean, I think that absolutely goes to the heart of what Brexit supporting MPs fear, and I'm sure many of the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit fear that the transition isn't really a transition, it's just an extension, and extension might be extended and extended and extended until it just becomes a continuation of the status quo. Downing Street would hit back very hard on that. They will say we are on our way out and people are going to notice a difference.
All right, we have to keep moving on, story after story after story. So can we move to the Labour Party at this point? And a story in the Sunday Times there, Carol, which is this mural which appeared in East London in the heart of what was the East London Jewish community. Just tell us a little bit about the story.
Well, it's this, I mean, it's this obviously grossly anti-Semitic image, which has been... a post from 2012, I think, has been uncovered. Jeremy Corbyn, he failed, I think, to condemn it. He hadn't really looked at the picture at the time. And he's just on... Jeremy Corbyn, he's like the Facebook of British politics. He's just sort of... He just keeps on doing the wrong thing. He cannot... We've seen how, as I say, how Facebook responded so terribly this week. Jeremy Corbyn is... He's sorry.
I mean, many of his supporters will say this is just
As actually I was, to be fair, looking at it.
I mean, we love to jazz about
another mainstream media attack on Jeremy Corbyn. We're always going at him for his facts, his views, and
I don't think you could characterise it like that. I mean, I'd kind of zoned this story out because it just, I don't know, I just didn't engage with it. And then I saw the image and I was like, oh my goodness, you know, what on earth was he doing? And it's, you know, it just feeds to this impression that the Labour Party just does have a problem under the current leadership with anti-Semitism. Do
you think the papers generally treat him properly and seriously, or do you think there is an agenda against him?
I think it's tricky because and you know, the Guardian's come in for a lot of criticism from that, and it's really, you know, it's really had to sort of look within itself and try and be even-handed. And I think the thing is, it's not even-handed, is it? No. The way that politics is covered in the British landscape.
OK, I don't know if either of you are adroit and quick-fingered enough to reach for your tablets, but I'd like to go to the New York Times now, because there's been these huge marches in Washington against the murders of children by guns and so on. And this seems to be a moment when Trump is in genuine trouble with a lot of sort of middle America. The first time.
Absolutely, and I mean the scale of these demonstrations was quite remarkable. I thought it was interesting to see the Obama's tweet last night on Michelle and Barack saying that they were so moved by the scale of the kind of the feeling here that something must be done, and it has gone on and on and on. Obama himself wasn't able to change things. Yeah. I don't feel, though, that Trump is going to sort of react to this by suddenly changing the gun laws. 1 million
people, they say, marching in Washington. 1 million people, many of them children.
I mean, I just love the fact that young people are the ones who are sort of bringing change. And, you know, my story, the Shamir, this 24-year-old who's come forward, the kind of bravery of these sort of young people coming out and on the record and saying this is not right. I think it's absolutely amazing.
Well, listen, thanks to both of you. They're very, very interesting. We've covered a lot of stories.
Now, he had a week he may want to forget. Labour's leader was accused by the former Northern Ireland Secretary, Lord Hayne, of being a Starlist. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, that wasn't meant as a compliment for sacking Owen Smith from the shadow cabinet when Smith repeated what many thought was simply Labour's Brexit policy. And then Jeremy Corbyn had to make a statement clarifying that when in 2012 he bemoaned the destruction of a grotesque anti-Semitic mural, he hadn't actually noticed that the mural was, well, anti-Semitic. As for her, she had one of her better weeks as she persuaded the entire European Union to put out a statement accusing the Russians of responsibility for the Salisbury poisonings, which is a little bit more than she expected of them. Though perhaps she was a bit embarrassed that Les Bleus, as the French are known, will be making that symbolically blue British passport when we Brexit. Now, this Thursday, Brexit will be just a year away. Is that boo-hoo or woohoo? What do you think, Allegra?
I think that the Sunday Times is suggesting this morning that it could be woohoo for the NHS because, look, they have this story that Theresa May has ordered a £4 billion Brexit boost for the NHS. Now, official sources this morning are saying this is overexcitable. The decision has not yet been taken. But any of us who cover this issue and speak to people in government about this think that this money is probably on the way, just perhaps not as quickly as the Sunday Times is asserting. Anyway, the point is, Robert will ask the Health Secretary later when he's on. Now, they are linking this to Brexit. It's basically a reward to you voters. If you stick with the government, you will get what you want for the NHS. Now, we thought also we would look at this picture over to the right. It is Macca. He's marching in Washington with his wife, and he's marching to end gun violence. And this morning on Twitter, we found this picture which tickled our fancy. This lady's saying that this picture deserves a Pulitzer, and she's right. This little lad out protesting, saying, and I can't even bring peanut butter to school. So true. Now, back here, the big story this morning is the other big story, apart from this NHS money, possible NHS money, is this. The Observer and Channel 4 have this scoop. They've got this Brexit insider claiming that the Vote Leave team may have broken the law in how they spent their money, their campaign finances. Overnight, the Foreign Secretary took to Twitter to say, Observer, Channel 4 story, utterly ludicrous. Vote Leave won fair and square and, critically, he says, legally. We are leaving the EU in a year and going global. So, Robert, for Boris Johnson, it is definitely a woohoo.
Yeah, it's a big surprise that Boris Johnson thinks we should be leaving the European Union, isn't it, Heidi? It's quite a complicated story, this story, about whether Vote Leave exceeded spending limits. The allegation from the whistleblower Shamir Sani is that he was directed when he was working for a side campaign by a man who now works in Downing Street called Stephen Parkinson, who's one of actually the longest-serving advisors to the Prime Minister. Now, Stephen Parkinson, in defending himself, says that he gave instructions to Shamir Sani because they were in a gay relationship. Now, Shamir Sani has subsequently said he should not have disclosed that because he wasn't out. And that's become a bit of a sort of story, whether or not Stephen Parkinson breached more than etiquette, really, in disclosing the nature of Shamir Sani's sexuality, particularly since he says, as a Pakistani with Pakistani relations, those relations are now in danger. How serious is this for Theresa May and Downing Street? Because she is close to Stephen Parkinson.
Yeah, well, I think the whole thing feels pretty filthy. And I think when you mix personal relationships and work, it can get messy, as it has done here. You know, my sense is the gay angle, the gay story, the relationship story feels like a bit of a smokescreen. But I think, like all these things, you need to get in there and find out exactly what has happened and separate the gossip and the discrediting, if you like, from actually what happened. And that's the important part.
Ben, I mean, as I say, Stephen Parkinson's defence is that he had to disclose the relationship, otherwise, you know, he would have been holding back something material. But what do you think about that?
I think it's very telling that rather than addressing the allegations and the very serious questions that are raised by this incredible journalism, a number 10 spokesman is going out and outing somebody whose family is thereby put in danger. And Boris Johnson is claiming there's nothing there. Well, with all respect, it's not up to Boris Johnson to decide. It's up to the Information Commissioner, the Electoral Commissioner and the police to decide whether there was any illegality. And it's interesting that in the article, Boris Johnson is clearly implicated because the whistleblower says that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove knew exactly what was going on.
Now, just to be clear, of course, Vote Leave are denying that they broke the rules. If, however, they are found to have exceeded the spending limits, what do you think the implications of that are, Heidi?
In terms of Brexit?
Yeah.
I think, you know, that there's two things here. Because ultimately, yes, if they've broken rules, the Electoral Commission, etc., fines, that's entirely appropriate and as it should be.
Do you think it reinforces the case? I mean, some on the Remain side will say it reinforces the case that there has to be another vote. What do you feel?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's likely, you know, because at the end of the day, yes, they may well have broken rules. Let's find out. But ultimately, have they just sought out their voters effectively? Incorrectly, of course, but that's different from saying whether people have been persuaded in an alternate fashion to how they may have been otherwise. I think we need to wait and see. I don't think it's impossible, but it would only... I think it would just potentially piggyback on wobbles that Leavers may be having. And like all these things, I think, you know, this is a moving picture. And time will tell. I think it's unlikely. I'd give it 2%, perhaps, but I'd say it's not impossible.
Brilliant. Well, listen, much more to pick up with the two of you in just a bit. So, much more to pick up on all of this with both of you, but I know that Allegra just has one or two things she wants to say.
Desperately burning to get this off my chest. Now, look, we know big data is pretty big now, but in the future it's going to be ginormous data. There are around 12 billion devices connected to the internet, monitoring your behaviour, and that's going to rise to 50 billion by 2020. Stupendous numbers that none of us can get our heads round. Let's just go through them. You'll be familiar with most of them. You've got Google taking a note of the digital trail you leave. You've got your supermarket records, be it online or your loyalty card, CCTV watching where you're driving, when, how fast, Amazon, the books you buy, even your iPhone health app, all taking note of that digital trail you leave. This is comparatively vanilla stuff. The question is where else it goes in the future. Now, we all know the terrible nightmare scenarios. You've got your bin, your recycling bin, perhaps having a record of what you're recycling when. Your fridge might have a record of when you eat, when you don't eat, when you might be particularly hungry, susceptible to having a chocolate bar sold to you. Then we have your car, taking notes of how fast you're driving, who knows who it shares it with. Apparently, in the future, an HR department could monitor your correspondence, the words you're using, and figure out when you might be on the verge of wanting to quit. Imagine that. And then even children's toys. Some of them could be hooked up to the internet, Wi-Fi enabled, whatever, and keeping a record of their play. These are just some of the many, many, many worries about where big data could go. There's a huge concern about how it's being used, how our lives are being monitored. Many want the government to regulate more to protect our privacy, but there's something of a generational divide about who cares about this stuff, and that is over here. So, breaks down as you might expect. You've got 51% of millennials not bothered or who do care about how companies handle their data, but that does mean quite a large number who are thinking they're a bit worried. It goes down, but again, in the older generation, a third are quite relaxed. So there is a clear picture that younger people are not so worried. But for some of the incredible insights this work on this area, our Geek of the Week is a long-time programme friend and one of the first geeks we ever did business with. Jamie Bartlett from Demos, you are... Here's the badge. Geek.
It's Geek of the Week.
Yes, so he's our Geek of the Week, my favourite moment of the whole programme. Now, if we could get back to what... Allegra was just talking about, which is the use or misuse of our data. I'm very struck that this morning the newspapers have almost all got a full-page advert from Facebook apologising for the way that its data was abused, allegedly by Cambridge Analytica, the controversial political campaigning company. How damaged do you think people's confidence in social media sites like Facebook really is? And do you think that governments should intervene much more to regulate the likes of Facebook?
Well, in terms of what damage, I think huge. I mean, personally, I don't do Facebook, but Facebook is more, I think, than any other social media platform, it's about family, friends, exchanging life stories. It's ingrained in people's homes. So I think the damage is absolutely huge because it's something people treat very personally. Does the government need to do more? Well, the data protection legislation that's coming through the government will undoubtedly help. And Matt Hancock has been very clear. You do it wrong, you break the rules, and you pay. You know, talk about Facebook fines perhaps over £1 billion.
Ben.
Interesting, these ads are coming out just over a week after Facebook tried to prevent The Observer and Channel 4 News and the New York Times actually printing the truth. I mean, that's the real battle that we're up against. Heidi's absolutely right. I mean, Jeremy just a moment or two said, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it's all the Electoral Commission, the Information Commissioner. These organisations do not have the powers. I mean, look at the farce this week of the Information Commissioner taking nearly a week to get a warrant to get into Cambridge Analytica. There's a great deal more to come out about this, a great deal more to come about the whole vote leave, the Russia stuff, and there's a lot more that will take our attention for the next. But the government's got to act. To pretend it's nothing to do with the government, we need the government's protection against these tech giants.
Let's take a look at some of the stories making the headlines this morning. We're joined by the City analyst and broadcaster, Louise Cooper, Deputy Director of think tank British Influence, Jonathan Liss, and news editor at the Institute for Economic Affairs, Kate Andrews. Lovely to see you all this Sunday morning, and thanks for not having a long lie and making the show on time. Jonathan, let's start, shall we, with the Observer, and a story which I think, when it was released last night, caught a number of people's attention. This is a slightly different take to the Cambridge Analytica stories that have been circulating, and more focused on funding this time round.
That's right. So this is a story about this man, Shamir Sani, who who was a volunteer of Vote Leave, and he's alleged that this £625,000 donation that was made by Vote Leave to another organisation, Believe, was kind of a sham donation, and in fact the organisation was sort of kept in-house, and that would be a breach of spending rules, because organisations are allowed to give money, but they can't then control how that money's spent, and it would have taken them over the limit. And so this is a question. Just
to be clear, it's not the fact that they gave money to Believe.
No, they're allowed to give money to whoever they wanted, but then the allegations are that there was then some form of limited coordination. Advice was sought and indeed given. Sani's given emails to the Observer, which appears to demonstrate some coordination. And so this is about sort of fairness, it's about accountability, and ultimately sort of confidence in the democratic process. There was so much that was happening in the referendum before it, on the composition of the electorate, during it, and this idea that, you know, legally, you can lie with impunity in British election law, provided you don't smear an individual, an opponent. So all kinds of things were allowed to be said on both sides. And now, obviously, this fundamental idea about fairness, about, you know, how much are we allowed to spend? Can we, in fact, guarantee that our democracy is free from interference and is secure? I
mean, Louise, just a quick look at social media lets you know that people who voted for Brexit seem to be quite happy with the democratic process, even given the allegations made in the Observer.
OK, so, first of all, this is two groups, Believe and Vote Leave. Well, guess what? It's kind of in the title. They have the same goal, which is for the UK to leave the EU. So I get your point that this may or may not have broken spending limits, but it's not ballot stuffing, it's not postal fraud. This is a technicality about spending limits for two organisations that are essentially campaigning for the same thing. And I do think this is particularly made up because this is the Observer, a paper that wanted the UK to remain within the EU. Although, interestingly, the Mail on Sunday has gone with the same sort of story, but more specifically about the two individuals concerned. And again, I feel this is a Westminster bubble sort of story, the technicalities of the people involved, and one's an advisor to Theresa May and the other one's a homosexual who's been outed by him. It's all just, I think for most people looking at this, it'd be like, this is the reason why we've sort of become disillusioned with politics. It's a story that seems terribly nitty-gritty in the detail, not relevant to a lot of us.
I mean, Kate, technicality perhaps, but, you know, the fact that, according to the Observer, you know, documents, details were deleted by people in the campaign, it doesn't look good. But the question is, I think, as Louise raises, I mean, to how many people doesn't it look good?
Sure. Well, this is part of the problem, of course, is that there are a lot of people out there right now, on both sides of the pond, actually, in terms of the Trump election and also the vote to leave the European Union, who are looking for evidence that supports their claim that these efforts, these initiatives only won because someone was manipulating the data, because people were tricked into voting for these causes. Now, the Observer says that these claims are supported by mass documentation, so at the end of the day, it's going to be for the Electoral Commission to decide whether or not these claims are legitimate. I am hesitant, though, to jump to any conclusions because Leave, Vote Leave, and particularly the £625,000 claim has already been acknowledged and investigated by the Electoral Commission, and so far they haven't found any wrongdoing. Now, new evidence might change that, but we have to remember that this has already been looked into, and I think if you want to believe that somebody manipulated the Brexit vote, this is the kind of story you're going to gravitate towards.
Is that fair? I don't know. I mean, we all of us around this table, to an extent, are existing within the bubble. Whenever we talk about, you know, electoral fraud, it always seems to be kind of after the fact, and no result has ever changed, and nothing changes as a result of it.
But will people have voted differently because one pro-Leave campaign group gave another pro-Leave campaign group
right, though,
625 grand? Not necessarily, but if it's broken electoral rules, absolutely. But will people have been manipulated? It's quite a patronising thing to say to people, you've been manipulated. You wouldn't have really voted like that if you were as clever as us. I find that really quite insulting to the people who vote.
I don't think people are saying that. What people are saying is that all elections have campaigns. Those campaigns have to be regulated. They get funded from somewhere. There have to be caps in order to guarantee kind of a security and fairness in the process. Now, if one side is cheating, which hasn't been proved, of course, but if one side is, and this goes for Trump as well, then obviously there have to be ramifications. Now, it's not necessarily that we rerun the votes, but certainly certain things have to happen. Otherwise, we don't have a democracy, and it's just a free-for-all.
Kate, let's go to the front of the Sunday Times, and this is a Brexit boost for the NHS.
Yes, so despite Chancellor Philip Hammond's attempt to curb spending, particularly when it comes to the NHS, particularly because, as it's written here, Brexit headwinds could put the budget in a more comfortable or less comfortable position over the next coming years, it looks as if the Prime Minister is planning to overrule that, and it looks like she very well may pledge billions more of spending towards the NHS come this spring. It's estimated here to be about $4 billion worth, whereas the Chancellor this year gave $2.1 billion, so almost doubling the amount going into the NHS. But there are a few key things to flag in the story. First is this idea of a specific NHS tax, which I'm very skeptical of. Hypothecated taxes, specific taxes, very rarely actually target the areas you want them to. Gordon Brown tried to bring in higher national insurance specifically for the NHS, but overall it just went to increasing spending overall. So I think we have to be very careful about that. I also hate the politics around this, right? Theresa May is going to bring it in as part of a birthday present to the NHS. I mean, this is the way that the healthcare system is spoken about, and we need to look very seriously at both funding and the provisions of healthcare in the UK to get better results.
I mean, before an NHS tax, surely you'd be looking at the internal market within the NHS for room for improvement.
OK, so I made a documentary for Radio 4 about productivity in the NHS, and I was aghast quite how badly it was managed. So just look at, like, hip joints or knee joints. They can vary, and I can't remember the exact figures, but something like £500 to £2,000 for exactly the same knee joint or hip joint. It is so badly managed. The organisation needs to do far more internally to sort out its efficiency and productivity before more taxpayers' money is given to it. What people forget is that the amount that we spend on the NHS is constrained by economic growth and by the amount we put into it as taxpayers, and that is not an infinite amount of money.
What, Louise, then, about the story in the Mail on Sunday about the amount we're spending on our passports, or not?
So this has been the story this week that's got everybody irate, because here we are leaving the EU, we're going to get back our old blue British passports, everybody's excited about it. However, the contract has been given to a French-Dutch company, not the British de la Rue.
Heaven forfend.
How shocking is that? However, last night, Labour MP Frank Field, who's chair of the influential Work and Pensions Committee, he always gets involved in these things. Apparently, the problem with de la Rue, it's got a massive pension deficit, and it is absolutely huge compared to other companies that are also quoted. And there is a thought that the reason why they overpriced the contract to print British passports is because they wanted to make a load of money out of the British taxpayer in order to prop up its pension deficit. And this has caused all kinds of consternation, all kinds of unhappiness. So maybe De La Rue will be printing out British passports if they readjust their bid, although I don't think so.
I tell you, the political party that suggested you could actually choose the colour of your passports would probably gain by about 5% in the polls by my reckoning. And we should say De La Rue said this is absolutely not the case as well.
No, of course.
Louise, Jonathan, Kate, I'd really like to leave some time for the Leader of the House, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Now, it's been a hectic week in politics, dominated by revelations about Cambridge Analytica, and we've got our own exclusive on that story later. But that is far from the only major development this week, so here's a quick catch-up. On Monday, David Davis and his EU interlocutor Michel Barnier announced they had agreed a transition deal. And to celebrate, they'd coloured in much of the document with green highlighter pen. Back home, not everybody was so pleased.
The government had rolled over but had not even had its tummy tickled.
Several Tory MPs are deeply concerned that the EU will still control fishing rights until the end of the transition. Some ardent Brexiteers took to the water in protest.
The whole thing is a disaster.
Back on land, it is the 300-mile-long Irish border that's running like a fault line through the rest of the Brexit negotiations. Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said EU unity would never break down on the need for a cast-iron backstop solution.
The European Union and other member states understand as a whole that in some ways this is a test as to whether it is worth being a member of the EU or not.
Labour's Northern Ireland spokesman Owen Smith had an exit of his own this week from the shadow cabinet. He was sacked after calling for a referendum on the final deal. While the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was embarrassed by a Facebook post he'd responded to in 2012, where he appeared to endorse an allegedly anti-Semitic mural in London. Mr Corbyn said he regretted he didn't look more closely at the deeply disturbing image before querying its removal. Away from Brexit, Theresa May secured a joint statement from fellow EU leaders saying there was no plausible alternative to blaming Russia for the poisoning of Sergei Skripal. As the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker took time to congratulate Vladimir Putin on yet another election victory. Boris Johnson was a lot less diplomatic, claiming the Kremlin may use this summer's World Cup to boost the country's image, just as Hitler did with the Berlin Olympics.
I think the comparison with 1936 is certainly right.
The Russian ambassador was furious.
The British government is free to make a decision about its participation in the World Cup, but nobody has the right to insult the Russian people.
Back in Blighty, the government announced that over 1 million NHS staff will get a pay rise over the next 3 years. Labour reminded Jeremy Hunt it was less than a year ago that Theresa May had told nurses there was no magic money tree. And news that a French firm had won the contract to produce the new blue post-Brexit British passports provoked much Eurosceptic fury. But maybe it's actually a perfect illustration of the government's case that we're leaving the EU but not leaving Europe, and even after Brexit, we'll still be kissing cousins. So let's pick up on all those big stories with our panel. Let's run through what kind of week both the government and the Labour Party have had. Starting with the Brexit transition deal. Camilla, score one for the UK government?
Well, score one in probably getting it away. However, the Brexiteers, as you saw there in the clip with Jacob Rees-Mogg not being happy, aren't happy, but then the government's argument is, well, they're never going to be because it was always going to be a status quo agreement so that while we're in transition, we can then work out how we're actually going to logistically do everything we need to do to Brexit. So the Leavers aren't happy, hence the fish-throwing escapade that Nigel Farage got involved in.
Yes, because you see the government always said it would be a status quo transition. The one thing they did say, actually, was we'll leave the common fisheries policy the day we leave the EU.
Specifically, Michael Gove, and he, of course, had to then backtrack and say or agree in Parliament that it was suboptimal to suggest that we would still be subject to the CFP. The government are saying we need to play a long game here. It's short-term pain for long-term gain. And, of course, we saw earlier on Marr, David Davis, insisting insisting that we would not be subject to the CFP and we'd be controlling our own waters when it actually comes to the end of transition at the end of 2020.
And whilst Theresa May was in Brussels signing off the transition deal, she also managed to pull off a fairly impressive diplomatic feat over Russia.
Hugely impressive, having been at the summit and cover this. I mean, the big bonus for her is that the transition deal was squared away on Monday. David Davis and Michel Barnier had done that. So she had 36 hours in Brussels entirely dedicated to Russia. And I think going into this summit, from the foreign ministers meeting beginning of the week, where quite frankly the EU were all over the place on how to react, from vague condemnation of something to it was Putin and we need to get him. And by the end of Thursday night, about 2 in the morning, Friday morning, when all us hacks were still in the Brussels pubs trying to get back to our hotels, not wanting to file yet more copy on this summit, this extraordinary statement dropped of universal condemnation and attribution to Moscow for Salisbury. And then we saw on Friday nation after nation pledging their own spy expulsions, which will be on Monday. So for Theresa May to turn all that round on, quite frankly, a pretty hostile wicket for her, because she's not exactly the EU's most favourite person, I thought was a significant achievement.
So Zoe, did the gloss come off some of these achievements when Boris Johnson ended up comparing Russia hosting the World Cup to Hitler in the Olympics in 1936?
Well, I don't think, yeah, I mean, if anybody can scorch the gloss off anything, it'll be Boris Johnson and his stupid analogies. I don't really agree with any of that, because I think if
Not even a little bit of it? The whole thing? All of it is rubbish.
I like your tone of voice.
I'll take that.
For the EU not to have condemned Russia, for them not to have taken coordinated action, for them to have actually taken the background of our slightly, you know, unpleasant relationship with them at the moment and used that in order to kind of make a different response to Russia would have been absolutely seismic. So there was nothing else that they could have done and nothing else that they would have wanted to do, I wouldn't have thought.
Although Jean-Claude Juncker did send a gushing note of congratulation to His Excellency Vladimir Putin, which went down very badly with his own member states.
Absolutely loves Putin historically as well and plays tennis with the wives of his main supporters. There's absolutely no shortage of people in the EU.
It's strange to say Boris loves Putin.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference in how you congratulated before and after the Salisbury poisoning.
Well, listen, there is a history of people having either cozying up to or making bellicose language against Putin to serve their own political expedience, and it doesn't actually tell very much in the long run. The point is that for the EU not to have got behind the UK in this situation would have been much, much more problematic than you're kind of letting on with those sceptical faces. So,
but look where they were at the beginning of the week. Foreign ministers meeting on Monday.
Yeah.
There was no attribution of blame to Russia. Friday morning, there was. That's an achievement. Even done by a Tory Prime Minister, Zoe. Go on, give her that much.
Seriously, you think that Theresa May persuaded them to look at evidence and then persuaded them to believe it? You
Very
don't
much
think
so.
they just looked at evidence and believed it?
No, because they went to this entire summit not wanting to do this. You know, the Hungarians, the Greeks, the Italians, none of them wanted to condemn Russia because they've got big business links. That's where their alliances are.
I think what you're doing.
She got Macron and Merkel on side.
I think what you're doing, and I think
you two are going to have to agree to disagree on this for a second, and we'll just move on. David Davis was on the Andrew Marr show, and he was asked about a story that's around this weekend about links between Vote Leave and Cambridge Analytica, the company that's been in all the headlines this week. So let's take a quick look at what he said.
The individuals concerned have denied it. It's really a matter, if there's any truth to it at all, for the Electoral Commission to investigate, but that's for them to decide, not for a minister to say.
So Camilla, that was David Davis brushing off these links, and there are a couple of stories around this weekend about whether Vote Leave contracted with a company associated with Cambridge Analytica, but there's also some story about how money was that Vote Leave had spent all they could in the referendum campaign and whether they were using other organisations to channel funding.
Did they align to Believe in order to pool resources to spend more than they're allowed? Now, my understanding is the Electoral Commission has already investigated this several times and not found a case to answer. That's not to suggest that we don't have a problem with party and campaign funding in this country. I think we do. To extrapolate from that, and I think there are a lot of people looking at this story slightly scratching their heads and confused. Are we then able to make the leap that that because of this scandal involving Cambridge Analytica, that people were forced into voting for something they didn't want to vote for. No, I don't think we can say that. Equally, there was a massive Remain campaign, including leaflets that were posted through people's letterboxes with actual lies on them. So if we're talking about subverting the vote in some way, this is a game of two halves. I'm not saying it doesn't merit investigation. I'm questioning whether there are people on the doorsteps of Britain today going, we must have a look into Stephen Parkinson's links with X, Y and Z. However, I think he's probably in trouble when it comes to, you know, his future in government, because he is very close to Theresa May.
Sorry?
I think that's really peculiar. It's not about whether they align to Believe, it's about whether the Believe was sort of a cooked-up outfit consisting of two of their volunteers.
But it's been investigated
but that's what Camilla says has been investigated already.
It's been twice already, and they haven't found a case to answer. Well, what's the response to that, if they've already investigated them?
The response is that if you're talking about a large amount of money that's funneled from one organisation in order not to breach its spending limits into an organisation that it made up with its own personnel, and if you're then talking about that money being spent with an organisation which they all deny links with and then suddenly they don't, and if you're then talking about that organisation having its own nefarious case to answer, then you are building a case of rules being contravened, and everybody has to prepare themselves, if it turns out that this was wrong, for the idea that maybe the referendum result was wrong.
Now, we need to talk about the Labour Party as well, because there's been some fairly significant developments with them this week. Owen Smith sacked on Friday night from the shadow cabinet for saying there should be a second referendum on Brexit. Tom Newton-Dunn, I mean, to what extent does this expose the divisions that there are still within the shadow cabinet and at the top of the Labour Party?
To paraphrase a quote, I don't think much has changed. Nothing has changed. The Labour Party has been split down the middle over Brexit and whether to have a second referendum or not for a year and a half since this whole thing began. Owen Smith went probably a little bit too far on purpose. Giving an interview to The Guardian and making it very clear was a challenge to Jeremy Corbyn's authority, and I think that's why...
And there had been rumours that he was thinking of resigning over Corbyn's stance on Russia during the week anyway.
This does look a little bit more like an opportunistic move by Owen Smith than a real row about a second referendum. He struck a moment of huge weakness for Jeremy Corbyn, not just Jeremy Corbyn's rather odd stance on Russia, not wanting to attribute blame to Moscow for Salisbury, but also remember the mural affair, which all was exploding by Friday evening. Jeremy Corbyn is under probably the greatest pressure since the general election in his leadership, and his enemies, of which Owen Smith is a well-known member of that camp, are looking to exploit that.
Well, we're going to pick up all of those stories with the Labour Party with Labour's Shadow Transport Secretary, Andy MacDonald, who is in Middlesbrough. Thank you very much for joining us. Did it really merit sacking Owen Smith when he said he thought there should be a second referendum on Brexit? Because after all, he's in tune with most of the Labour Party membership on that, isn't he?
Well, I think it's about collective responsibility, and I think Owen has made it clear that he's not going to be bound by that principle. And it's not a first in British politics. It's been done many times before. If people can't subscribe to the collective view of a shadow cabinet or cabinet, they will leave.
Yeah, but so the other thing that's not a first is a member of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet saying that we should have a second referendum is not a first either. Diane Abbott did send a letter out to constituents in Hackney in which she said she would argue for the right of the electorate to vote on any deal that's finally agreed.
And I think the difference is that Diane has said that was clumsily worded. That's not her position, and she does stand by the collective responsibility principle of the shadow cabinet, and that's as distinct from Owen's position. I'm just sorry to see Owen go, because I think he articulated the case on Northern Irish issues so brilliantly, but he'll be a loss. But that's been his decision ultimately. He was not prepared to be bound by the collective responsibility, and that's the consequence.
At least one former Labour minister has suggested that the timing of this sacking may have been to distract from the row around Jeremy Corbyn and his response on Facebook about this anti-Semitic mural.
Well, I suppose that's the world of politics, conspiracy and counter-conspiracy, and seeing intrigue where there is none. I wish that we had the opportunity and the facility to manipulate issues to suit ourselves at every minute detail. I'm afraid events come too quickly for that, and we're trying to deal with each and every issue that presents in the right way. And Jeremy's done that over this mural issue.
Well, let's take a quick look at this mural so that our viewers know what we're talking about and explain some of the background to it. So this was painted on a wall in East London. We'll take a look at a picture of it now. It was going to be whitewashed over. The artist was complaining on Facebook about this and got the support of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, he's since said that he didn't look at it closely enough, but you can see it. It's pretty obviously horribly anti-Semitic.
Well, I can't see it. I don't have that facility, but I've seen it, and it is obviously anti-Semitic. I saw it for myself, but Jeremy's made it clear that he glanced at that. He didn't look at it properly. He was making his comment in the context of freedom of expression of artists painting murals and so on. But he's made it beyond any doubt whatsoever that this is a repugnant image. He doesn't associate himself with it, and he's regretted having made the remark that he did.
Yeah, he regrets it. He hasn't apologised for it.
Well, I think, you know, regret. We're sorry. If you regret, you are sorry, and that's exactly right. But in fairness, Laura, in the interest of balance, let's think about Jeremy's wonderful record in standing up for human rights and at being at the forefront of opposing anti-Semitism and all forms of discrimination.
Really, well, it's because it's the Labour Party's record in opposing anti-Semitism that gets called into question here. I mean, a complaint has actually gone to the NEC now, complaining that Corbyn has brought the party into disrepute. And if he was still a backbench MP and not the leader of the party, he would definitely be being investigated for that now, wouldn't he?
Well, he has directly responded to the issue, and he has agreed entirely that this is an unpleasant, repugnant image, and he regrets the comment made in 2012 or whenever it was. But I do ask that that be seen in the context of him opposing and speaking up against some of the atrocities visited upon Jewish communities in Istanbul and in Paris, right across Europe and elsewhere.
And yet this question of anti-Semitism continues to dog the Labour Party. It comes up again and again. Why is it, do you think, that that we are always uncovering new things that people have been saying, comments that have been made, which mean that the Labour Party's commitment against anti-Semitism is constantly called into question?
Oh, I think that's absolutely beyond any doubt that there's a total commitment to have a zero-tolerance attitude towards anti-Semitism. And when these matters come to the fore, they have to be properly investigated. And those people who hold those views have no place in the Labour Party, or should I say, any mainstream political party. And we want to make sure that that's exactly what happens. But I just ask people to take into consideration the context of this and the proud record of somebody who's made a lifelong commitment to standing up for human rights across the globe. And I think it needs to be seen in that context, Laura.
Andy MacDonald, thanks very much for talking to us.
Labour has suggested that the police could be called in to investigate claims that the Vote to Leave campaign broke spending rules during the EU referendum. A whistleblower has alleged that the official Brexit campaign used another group, Believe, to overspend by donating money to it and then directing how it should be spent. All those involved deny any wrongdoing.
The story of the whistleblower in today's newspapers is very significant, and what I think needs to happen is Theresa May needs to make sure the Electoral Commission has the resources to fully investigate the allegations made that there was collusion and criminal collusion. Because let's remember, the people that led these campaigns are now senior cabinet members, and I think we need to make sure that they were not aware of what was going on, and that's why I think the resources are needed. And if needs be, the police should be resourced to investigate as well.
Well, let's talk now to our political correspondent, Tom Rayner in Westminster. Tom, very serious allegations. What happens now?
Well, at the heart of this is what this 625,000 donation is going to be seen as by the Electoral Commission. They have already looked at that donation, which came from the officially designated Vote Leave campaign, was sent to Believe, which was a youth group, also pro-Brexit. Now, that was seen as an independent group, and there are no problems with that on the face of it. Vote Leave has a spending cap of £7 million, and all these independent groups had a spending cap of £700,000. That is all fine, so long as there is no coordination between the two groups, because at that point they would come under the same spending cap, and clearly the money would go beyond the limit that was set. Now, what's new is that an individual who was an outreach worker for Vote Leave but then went on to work for Believe has gone on the record as a whistleblower to claim that there was coordination and that a payment to the Canadian data processing and data analysis company AIQ was instructed by Vote Leave as the way that Believe should use that money. Well, it's caused a lot of outrage amongst some. Vote Leave, and indeed those involved with Believe, Darren Grimes, who was its founder, have strongly denied any wrongdoing, and indeed the Foreign Secretary, who was a key figure in Vote Leave, has slammed the reports. He said in a post on Twitter, "The Observer and Channel 4 story is utterly ludicrous. Vote Leave won fair and square and legally. We are leaving the EU in a year and going global." Well, that was pretty strong words from the Foreign Secretary. When the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, was being interviewed earlier today, he was a little bit more restrained.
It's really a matter, if there's any truth to it at all, for the Electoral Commission to investigate.
It is obviously a matter for the Electoral Commission.
It is, properly a matter for the Electoral Commission to look into these things.
So you heard there from the other government ministers who are also being interviewed today, clearly the line being this is for the Electoral Commission to investigate. What is it that the Electoral Commission will be expected to ascertain? The question is this: did the Vote Leave campaign group manage to orchestrate and coordinate with Believe? That is the claim of the whistleblower. Vote Leave claim they did not do that, that Believe were completely free and independent in the way they used that money. That is what the Electoral Commission will be looking at. They've looked at the issue in the past and found that there wasn't any wrongdoing. The question will be whether Shamir Sani, who is this whistleblower, has provided them with new evidence to suggest that there was coordination.
OK, Tom, thank you.
I've been getting